Hey, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a law that's been making a lot of headlines in India, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, or PMLA. It's a really powerful and complex piece of legislation with some truly unique and, let's be honest, pretty controversial features. So let's dive right in. All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We're essentially going to follow the journey of a case from start to finish. First up, what even is the crime of money laundering? Then we'll see how authorities actually follow the money and seize assets. We'll meet the key players involved, unpack the law's most talked about feature, and finally, we'll look at the consequences for those found guilty. Okay, so to really wrap our heads around the PMLA, we've got to start with the absolute basics. What are we even talking about here? The term money laundering gets thrown around all the time, but what does it actually mean under the law? Well, the law's definition is interesting. It's both super specific and incredibly broad at the same time. So, according to Section 3 of the Act, money laundering is way more than just, hiding cash in a suitcase. It's literally any involvement in the process. Whether you help conceal it, you possess it, you acquire it, or use funds that you know are dirty, you're considered part of the crime. Basically, it's a definition designed to cast a super wide net. And that leads us right to this key phrase, proceeds of crime. This is the dirty money we're talking about. Now, here's the really important part. This money has to be linked to what's called a scheduled offense. You can think of this as the first crime, the original illegal act, like corruption or drug trafficking, that generated the cash in the first place. Without that, there are no proceeds to launder. And this right here really gets to the core philosophy of this law. It's all about following the money, not just the person who committed the crime. It really doesn't matter who's holding the asset, a relative, a business partner, anyone. If it can be traced back to a scheduled offense, it's considered proceeds of crime, and that's when the PMLA can kick in. Okay, so authorities have a hunch that some assets are, proceeds of crime. What happens next? Well, the PMLA gives them a whole lot of power to act, but it's not a free-for-all. There's a very specific, structured process they have to follow. It all kicks off with something called a provisional attachment. Basically, an officer from the Enforcement Directorate can temporarily freeze any assets they believe are linked to money laundering. But this isn't permanent. The case then moves to an adjudicating authority, which looks at the evidence. And only if the accused is later found guilty in a totally separate criminal trial are those assets permanently taken by the government. But that initial freeze, it can't just last forever, right? The law is super strict about this and sets a hard deadline. Any guesses on how long that is? Yep, 180 days. That's it. Authorities have a solid 6-month window for that provisional attachment. It's a really critical check built right into the law, basically to make sure cases don't just get stuck in limbo at this early stage. All right, we've been throwing around a few official titles already, so let's break down who the key players actually are, the ones investigating and deciding these cases. First up, you've got the top brass, like the director of the Enforcement Directorate, who can authorize big moves like arrests and attachments. The investigation itself, that's handled by ED officers. Now, this next part is super important. Legally, an ED officer is not considered a police officer. And why does that matter? Well, it means statements made to an ED officer can be used as evidence in court, which is a huge difference from confessions made to the police. Then you have the adjudicating authority reviewing the property side of things, and the final criminal trial happens in a designated special court. And just to get a little more specific on that adjudicating authority, it's not just one judge. It's actually a 3-person body made up of a chairperson and 2 other members. Their entire job is to review the evidence for these asset attachments. Okay, so now we get to what is, without a doubt, the most powerful and, honestly, the most debated part of this entire law. It's a feature that basically flips a core principle of criminal justice completely on its head. So, in pretty much all standard criminal law, you know the saying, innocent until proven guilty. The prosecution has to prove you did it. The PMLA, it flips that script entirely. Under Section 24, it creates something called a reverse onus. This means the law just presumes that any assets connected to the case are dirty money. The burden of proof then shifts to the accused to prove their property is legit. I mean, think about that for a second. The state doesn't have to prove your assets are dirty. You have to prove they're clean. That is a huge legal shift, and it is the engine that gives this law so much of its teeth. But there is one really vital safeguard built in here. Remember that scheduled offense we talked about? The original crime that kicked this whole thing off? Well, if the accused is ultimately found not guilty of that crime, the money laundering case just collapses. It's gone. The PMLA charge can't survive on its own. Which brings us to our final section. So, what happens if someone is actually convicted by that special court? Well, the standard punishment is something called rigorous imprisonment for at least 3 years, and that can go all the way up to 7 years. And yeah, there's a fine on top of that too. But hold on, it can get even more serious. If the money laundering is tied to something like drug trafficking, for example, that maximum prison time jumps from 7 years all the way up to 10. And what about those assets? The ones that were frozen way back at the beginning of this whole process? Well, once there's a conviction, they are permanently confiscated by the central government. The whole journey is complete. And that really brings us to the big question at the heart of all this. The PMLA is obviously a powerful weapon against financial crimes that can wreck entire economies. But its power comes directly from that reverse onus clause. So the fundamental question we're left with is this. To fight these huge, complex financial crimes, is it actually necessary to shift that burden of proof, to take it off the state and put it onto the individual? It's something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.